myself.
Oh, it tells me I have to rotate my phone.
Started here shortly. We have all of our media team here. If you see them get up, they're just trying to get a better view of what we're doing here today. We're going to have our witnesses when you're called up to have your seat here on the witness stand. And we will have our folks live streaming on Detroit Will Breathe's Facebook page, as well as Detroit Will Breathe's IG page, as well as the Coalition for Police Transparency and Accountability's IG page. So we will get started. I am going to the lead and hand it off to Sammy to do introductions as of the tribunal, as well as Sammy to do introduction of the People's Prosecutor. So Sammy, take the stage and take it away. All right.
We are here today to defend Black lives, demand justice, and uplift the life of Hakim Littleton, who was a young man executed by the Detroit Police Department on Friday, July 10th, 2020. We will be putting the officer on trial that killed Hakim, as well as DPD as a whole. In this tribunal, we will hear testimonies from various witnesses who will introduce Hakim and who exactly he was. We will hear about DPD's intimidation tactics and the brutality that protesters faced as they showed up to the scene of 6 Mile in San Juan to demand answers in regards to what happened to Hakim. We will also hear about the racist and brutal history of the police. This movement is a movement that fights for all Black lives and states that all Black people deserve the benefit of the doubt. For 150 days, we have been in the streets fighting for Black lives and being met every day with assault from DPD and police in other counties as well. Just yesterday, Shelby Township Police harassed, intimidated, and aggressively arrested protesters and legal observers, and continued at the Shelby Police Station where we ran jail support. It's clear we are doing the right thing, and the police will do whatever it takes to silence us. Listen today, and you will be the judge of whether DPD executed a disarmed man. You will be the judge of their actions as it relates to targeting and harassment of Black people, and you will determine if the cops have acted unlawfully. Now I am very pleased to introduce you to the People's Prosecutor, Victoria Burton-Harris, the intelligent, bold, badass Black woman who ran a great campaign for Wayne County Prosecutor, and I'm sure will be making more waves very soon. Victoria earned her BA in Political Science and African American Studies from the University of Michigan Ann Arbor, and then went on to earn her JD from Wayne State University Law School. She began her legal career working with William W. Swore, where she honed her advocacy skills in the area of criminal law, both in state and federal court. In 2014, Victoria started McCaskey Law right in the heart of downtown Detroit, specializing in criminal and family law. At McCaskey Law, she has won cases on behalf of young people, community organizers, women experiencing violence, and victims of police brutality. When Victoria started her law firm, she had the vision of being a people's lawyer, using her law degree to be a vehicle for change and a voice for the voiceless. Victoria's passion for justice and equality have all led her to the involvement with several grassroots organizations as a legal advisor, including but not limited to We the People Detroit, Metro Detroit Association for Cab Drivers, EYP 100, and the New Era Detroit. Victoria has served on the Legal Services Advisory Committee for Haven of Oakland County, developing trauma-informed training criteria and procedures for attorneys handling domestic violence cases. She currently sits on the New Lawyers Advisory Board for the Institute of Continuing Legal Education, Board of Directors for National Lawyers Guild, and the Board of Directors for the Covenant House, Michigan, a youth homeless shelter where she develops a mentoring program for residents. Victoria is also a proud and active member of the National Conference of Black Lawyers Detroit chapter under the leadership of Jeff Edison, who has instilled in her the words of Charles Hamilton Houston. A A black lawyer is either a social engineer for justice or a parasite on society. So now, let's give a warm welcome to the extraordinary woman and prosecutor herself, Victoria Burton-Harris.
Thank you. The hashtag too, so hopefully people use it. The justice.
As you heard from Jamie from Detroit will breathe, we are here today for a very specific reason, and that reason is that Hakim Littleton, more so his family, have never received justice. This is as close as we may get to that moment, and we're asking that you all take this testimony very seriously and that you listen, that you watch the evidence that will be presented to you today, and that you in turn render a verdict. We're asking that you listen to testimony of Hakim's family and his friends, that you allow that testimony to replace whatever narrative is in your mind and in your heart that has been put there by media and elected officials. We're asking that you then listen to an analysis of the execution of young Hakim. That'll be done by showing you a video of the execution, and then an analysis of that video by Brother Mark Fancher from the ACLU. Lastly, you will hear testimony concerning DPD's history of excessive force, using abusive tactics as it relates to the black community and how they respond to people in the black community, and how DPD has a history of targeting young black men in Detroit. We're going to ask you to make decisions on whether you feel, based on everything that's presented here today, if Hakim Littleton was in fact executed. We're going to ask you to make decisions and render a verdict about whether the Detroit Police Department used excessive force, used unnecessary force to take this young brother's life. And then we're going to ask you, lastly, to render a verdict about the Detroit Police Department's involvement, not just in this case, but in terrorizing black lives in the city of Detroit, and what it is that you need to see, what you want to see done about that, so we don't continue to lose more and more Hakims. At this time, I'm going to invite the aunt of Hakim Littleton to the stand.
Tribunal to read an obituary, Hakim Littleton's obituary. Hakim Littleton was only 20 years old and executed on July 10, 2020 by the Detroit Police Department. He was born in Chicago and raised in Detroit, Michigan. He was the son of Heather Fuller, a mother whom he loved and adored and trusted with his life. He attended high school and graduated. Hakim had several certificates, led in asbestos abatement, OSHA 30, aerial lift operator, forklift operator, and first aid CPR. Hakim was a young man that embodied, "I am my brother's keeper." Always protecting those who were bullied. He was a young man that was raised in a revolutionary consciousness. Hakim was politically aware of the racial injustices caused by those who oppressed his people. He was beyond his years with having the ability to come up with answers that could help the city of Detroit and the country. He reminds us all that we need to allow the youth to have leadership. Hakim did not have life on this earth long, but his spirit will live on forever through the voice of his family and the community. Hakim would be a catalyst that will forever change minds to engage in the battle to end police brutality. Hakim was very passionate about what he believed in. In a debate, he would go toe to toe with you, raising points you may not have thought about. Hakeem was a fire that would never quail. The ancestors have truly received a warrior. We may have lost the battle, but the war is not over. Hakeem's name will be remembered and etched in the smoke in the battlefield. Hakeem will be missed, but eternally never forgotten.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to call Hakim's girlfriend to the witness stand. Is Hakim's girlfriend here? Genovia, can you tell the court?
That's Malik.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
We just ask that you be patient. The young lady is absolutely still breathing, as we all know. So just be patient and give her a moment.
When you're ready, can you tell us who Hakim was to you? When you're ready, can you tell us who Hakim was and who he was to you?
Hakim was my boyfriend. He was in about 2 years. When this happened. I don't even really know what to say. Hakim was a protective person. If I were just to describe him, he was a really loving person. You could tell anybody he loved. He was always there for me anytime I needed him to be there for me. When I couldn't afford to get something, he was there. And me and my mom got to food. Living in the house, I always had something good. He was always on my back. That's the type of person he was for me.
Was Hakim a bad person?
No, he was not that person at all.
Was he a violent person?
He wasn't a violent person.
In the 2 years that you dated Hakim, what did you come to learn about him that in this moment you have an opportunity to share with us that we may not ever know and that certainly the Detroit Police Department won't ever tell us about him?
That the police tell you about him, like what happened that night or the day?
Can you clarify just a little more?
I was asking you more so about Hakim's character. If you would like to tell us, were you present on the day that this happened?
No.
She wasn't present during the time that it actually happened, but she was present the day that it happened, yes.
How did that day start off with you and Hakim? Let's go there.
Hakim wasn't with me that day or that morning. He was with me the night before. He ended up leaving. His mom came and got him. And I was just at the house and his friend called me. His brother. He was like his brother. His friend called me and told me what happened and I came over there. I didn't believe it at first until I started seeing the yellow light, the yellow tape and the lights. That's when it hit me that it really happened. And that's what happened.
Let's go back to Hakim's character. You said that he was a good person, he was not a bad person. And
He was a
wasn't
good
violent
person, he wasn't a bad person, he was a really protective person. Like I said, he was there for anybody that needed him. Anybody he knew that loved him, he loved him right back the same. It was never nothing fake with Hakim. He was real, he was 100 all the time. He was an honest person. He taught me a lot. Like, within life and within school, Black History. all that stuff. Half the stuff I know about my history, I probably wouldn't even have known without him. He was educated. He was real smart.
Can you give us some examples of some of the things that he taught you?
He taught me a lot about black professors. We watched a lot of documentaries. Most of the stuff was just about his mom. We just learned a lot of stuff. He just the type of person he was. We want to sit down and watch movies half the time. We sit down and we want to watch documentaries. That's the type of person he was.
You know the last documentary you all watched together?
I don't remember the name of it, but I do remember what it was about. It was we watched this movie. What was it called? The Man by the Door.
The spook was that night.
Yeah, the spook was set by the door.
That's one of my favorite that time.
Good choice, good choice.
That's the last movie I watched. I was braiding his hair, and that's what he wanted to watch. I mean, we like stuff like that. That's type of, like I said, it's type of person, people we are. Watch animal, we watch animal documentaries, we learn stuff about animals, black history, all that stuff. We really was like politics, we watch.
Did you guys ever discuss the Detroit Police Department together?
That's more like debate, really. Debated a lot of stuff. He go head up with you and debate like she's on.
Did he ever share his thoughts and feelings on Detroit Police?
He didn't like the way they handled a lot of stuff. Like everybody, he don't like the way they handle stuff. That's really was it. He was telling me other ways they could have handled the situation. How they didn't handle it, how it played out, how it could have played out differently. It was just a lot of stuff.
Did he ever, in any way, show you that he feared the Detroit Police?
Yeah,
How so?
a lot. He just cause we were so up to date and we always kept up with the police killers and stuff, he never really like, how do I explain this? Okay, I'll tell you an example, like maybe if we were walking down the street, if he'd see a cop and like they'd slow down, probably just like look at us just on some not minding our business stuff, he'd kinda get like, look, why they just stop like that? He'd kinda get like a little nervous, like, he just, cops there to protect, and he just like feared them.
Are you aware of any bad experiences that he had with the Detroit Police?
Anything that experience?
Any contact, any involvement with the Detroit Police that would lead him or cause him to be fearful?
No big one. Only one I remember is one day he was walking down the street on Wyoming, it was dark. Said the cops pulled up, asked him like where he was going, just questioning him. He was going home though, didn't do nothing. And the cops just drove off, but like that night he had never went home, he had to turn around, come back to my house, and was like, I almost lost my life, basically. He just, like, he was nervous, so I got him scared.
Thank you. Is there anything further that you'd like to share with us about Hakim? Thank you for sharing with us today. At this time, we'd like to call Genovia Pinky to the stand. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can you state your name for me?
Yes, Janabia Baby.
And how do you know Hakim?
Hakeem dated my daughter, Malika White.
And that was your daughter who just testified?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell us about Hakim?
The first thing I think of when I hear Hakeem is I think of his heart. Hakeem had a very large heart. Hakeem was like a son to me. He was always thoughtful. We talked a lot, conversated a lot. He was very open and honest with me. He was just a good person. Overall, he was a great person.
You said he was open and honest with you. Did he ever have conversations with you about Detroit police? His feelings about the police?
Yes.
What did he share with you?
He shared his I believe to be fair, about the police department, about, how he just felt like he was being, antagonized by the police, at times. Very nervous sometimes, like my daughter said. I remember the day when, he was walking home from work and the police stopped him and asked him, like, where are you going, where are you coming from? And that made him nervous. And so.
Where did Hakim work, to your knowledge?
He worked at a store.
Hakim sharing with you how the Detroit police made him nervous, made him fearful. Did he ever, to your knowledge, have any other experiences with the police?
To my knowledge, that was it. I'm sure there probably was more experiences for it to be nervous. Unfortunately, in the date and time that we live in, it's with a non-black man and just driving in your car or whatever the black man may be doing at the time. It's like it can make anybody nervous.
What neighborhood did Hakim live in? Can you speak a little bit louder for me?
Yes, he lived in a very nice neighborhood.
Is it a neighborhood that you would say has a strong police presence in a positive way?
That I'm not sure of. I don't know.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us about Hakim? This is a time where you can openly talk and share and give a different narrative other than the one that's been painted by James Craig and the media.
Oh, wow. Well, that's really easy. Like I said, he's a very caring, loving young man who had a future ahead of him. And by all means, he was reaching for his goal. And it was just a shame, in my opinion, that his life had to be taken in the way that it was taken. To me, it was not necessary. You could have brought him down without murdering him. So and everyone liked Hakim, and there are so many people who still to this day, I still hear people talk about Hakim and how Hakim died. And we don't understand it. We don't understand why he had to go to the extreme that it did when he was executed. And in my opinion, that's what it was.
What do you think could have been done differently so that Hakim would still be here with us?
Once they had Hakim down, there was no need for the police officers to point the gun directly to his head and shoot him twice in the head. Our police officers are supposed to be trained. They're supposed to have the knowledge. They're supposed to know how to take down without taking life. And I know we're all humans, we have emotions, we have feelings, but at the same time, you're supposed to have training for this. And whatever tactics that you are being taught, they need to be retaught. It needs to be looked at much closer because this is happening way too often.
You spoke about the fear that Hakim had, not for any specific reason that you're aware of, but maybe in connection to the fact that he's a black man in America in this day and age. Do you think, in your opinion, that fear had anything to do with Hakim's actions that day?
Yes, I do. And not to take up too much of time, but I'm just gonna say this. In the society that we live in, and if you go back in history, you think about, and especially in the South, you think about how the moms, the dads, the aunties, the uncles feared for their young ones. You can't do this, you can't go there, you can't say this, you can't walk this way, you have to be a certain way, and even then, that's not guaranteed. So, if that thought is passed down from generation to generation, what else can you do? You have to install fear. These young people have to have fear, and then they pass that down, and they pass that down. Especially considering the history of the violence that is our young people have to encounter on a regular day. They don't know if they're gonna make it home. They don't know if they're gonna make it to the store, to the family's house, and unfortunately, I know there's a lot of crime out there, but unfortunately, a lot of the crime that's been committed is by police officers that either have this power trip, maybe, have their emotions running high, maybe, so you just never know. And I feel like his actions had to do with the history of what our young black people have been dealing with for centuries.
Very powerful. We all know that there was a gun involved on Hakim's end. Can you tell me if, in your opinion, you believe that him having that gun was also connected to this fear of being a black man in America?
I do believe that. I do believe that, especially with the talks that Hakim and I have had. Yes.
What kind of talks have you had?
Just being a black man in America, and how society has treated some young black people. If you're looking a certain way, or driving a certain certain clothes, or certain areas, certain people you hang out, you're automatically associated with some negativity. So,
Did he feel like he needed to take steps and measures to protect himself?
I believe he felt like he needed to protect himself, yes. And Hakim is a protector. He protected. He protected when he was at my house. He protected his little sister, his mom. He is a protector. That's who he was.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us? Any last words to leave us with about Hakim?
I think whatever Hakim was feeling and going through that day, it's hard when you hear, sometimes you hear people's comments. You can be at a restaurant, you hear a comment. You be in an Uber, taxi, and then all of a sudden that Uber driver makes a comment about something. It's hard, but they didn't know him. They didn't know his heart. They only saw the action that they saw on television. And I'm proud that I got to know him. And the time that I had with him, I'm very thankful very thankful for it. Because not only was he a protector, like my daughter said, you learned a lot from him. He was a young man with a lot of thoughts and very educated. I learned a lot from him.
Well, I think it's safe to say we've all learned a lot from you about who Hakim really was. And we're grateful that you were able to take the stand today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So then, for whoever else is speaking today, we have to spray the mics down. So if you're comfortable taking your mask off, just so that it's a little bit better sound quality for the live stream, if you could do that. But of course, if you're not comfortable, no worries.
Is my sound okay? Sammy, is my sound okay, or do I need to remove mine?
I can hear you fine. I know I could hear you back there, so.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So next I'd like to call Nakia Wallace, an activist with Detroit Will Breathe, to the stand.
Sorry, just if everybody could mute their phones and put it on silent, and if you have a phone call, you could take it outside of this room. That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Nakia.
Hi.
Can you tell me what brought you here today?
Well, a series of unfortunate events. What brought me here today? What brought me here today was the murder of Hakim Littleton.
Did you know Hakim?
No, I did not.
How did you become involved in the community response to Hakim's execution?
Well, I was involved for two reasons. One, I'm an organizer and a co-founder of an organization named Detroit Will Breathe. But also, I'm a proud Detroit girl and a resident of the Bagley neighborhood.
And this happened in the Bagley neighborhood?
Yes.
Okay. When did you first hear about this incident?
I heard about the incident. I'm not sure. I know it was afternoon, early afternoon. I was actually at home, and I saw the video on Facebook live streaming. And then I realized that it was on San Juan, and it was just 2 blocks from where I live. And so it had happened a few hours earlier, or maybe 1 or 2 hours earlier, and I decided to go around the corner and check it out and see what was happening.
What was going through your mind as you went around the corner to see what was going on 2 blocks away?
Well, at this point, where we were nationally in Detroit, I think we had reached 50 days, or we were coming up on 50 days of consistent daily protests, fighting against police brutality and fighting against the right of the police to murder and terrorize us with impunity, and fighting against general forms of oppression to Black and brown and poor people. So it was quite shocking to me to hear that they had the audacity to murder a child in the streets. But it also wasn't that shocking, because it is that audacity that is the reason why we, Detroit Will Breathe, exist. It's the reason why we need to exist.
When you got to the scene, what did you see?
When I got to the scene, the first thing that I saw was caution tape. There was maybe 25 people when I first got there. There was a crowd quickly forming, though. There were officers with long guns. I'm not a gun person, I don't know the name of them, but the long ones on their hips. They had a line. There were plainclothes officers, and there was ceasefire, which is
supposed to, I believe, help the police communicate with gangs, but they have been working protests this summer.
As if the protesters are gang members.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you arrive on the scene. Did you interact with the Detroit police at all?
What do you mean by interact?
Did you approach them and ask them what happened? What was going on?
I don't talk to the cops. What I did do was get a bullhorn, and I also informed the Detroit Reprieve team that they had actually murdered somebody, that was not false. And then we quickly began to try to mobilize people to the streets. And so we decided that we were going to demand, one, for Chief Craig to come and address the crowd, two, that they release the names of particularly the officer who fired the kill shot. And we also wanted them to release any video footage. So those were our three demands.
And you did that with the help of how many organizers and activists on the ground that day?
That's a great question that I don't have the answer to because it moved really quickly. I do know that there were several other organizers there and there were several other organizations there.
Would you say, how many people would you say just generally
I
appeared
suck
on
at
the
this.
scene after maybe the first hour of you being there?
Yeah, I really suck at that. What I know is I could see up 6 Mile, which is commonly referred to as McNichols, when I first arrived. But towards the end, you couldn't see the street anymore. That's how many people were there.
And were you shouting out the demands on your bullhorn?
Yes, we were chanting them. And we were also chanting, say his name, Hakim Littleton, when we found out what his name was.
How did the police respond to you and your fellow organizers and activists?
I think in the beginning they were afraid because they knew that they had just murdered somebody. And I think at the time, Minneapolis was burning. And so they were afraid. And we also, we stated to them very clearly, your chief has you out here alone. Your chief has you out here alone. But they were also very trigger happy. They were trigger happy, and you could tell they couldn't wait to bust up the crowd as soon as they got a command.
That's interesting that you just described them initially as fearful and with their hands on their weapons. Do you believe that that was in connection with the fear?
I can't, I don't know what it's like to be a cop. So I can't even speculate to that. They always have their hands on their weapons though, so I don't know. Maybe they were always afraid, or that's just their training, or that's just what they do, or I don't know.
Interesting. How long were you out there?
Well, I got arrested, so not that long, maybe 3 or 4 hours.
Talk to me about what, in your opinion, from your perspective, what led to your arrest?
I think that I was arrested because I'm a known community organizer. I think that I was arrested because, I think I was targeted. I also think the tear gas that they had shot through the crowd, the beating of us with batons, very quickly, it became very apparent to them that that wasn't working as a tactic of stopping the crowd from demanding answers. And so in an attempt to break up the crowd, they attempted to arrest the leaders or anybody who had a bullhorn or who had a microphone.
Let's back up. So you've been out here for a total of 3 to 4 hours, you said. When you first got there, it was quite empty. And then people started to appear more and more. You began shouting to your protesters and leading a chant on a bullhorn. And you were talking to them as well with your demands and telling them that they were alone. What did they do right after that?
Could you clarify the question a little bit?
So after you had began to mobilize your protesters and you all started to shout your demands to the police and to remind them that they were all alone, how did the police respond?
I think the thing that needs to be made clear about July 10th was that there was heavy community mobilization, that the people on the front lines on July 10th were young black people from Bagley and Fitzgerald. So that created a different kind of dynamic. And in truth, that probably was a scarier situation for the police than it was to just confront protesters.
Can you explain what you mean by that? For those who are not familiar with the Bagley community, can you explain to us why the mobilization of the community from that neighborhood was so important and impactful?
I don't know that it would have mattered what neighborhood people came from, but just Detroiters coming out en masse to hold the police department accountable is a particularly scary situation for them to be in.
To your knowledge, is that normal?
Yes.
Okay. How did the police respond to that?
Well, what did they do? They shot tear gas into the crowd. They beat people with batons. They arrested some of us.
Were they communicating anything back to you all, or just taking action?
So I did not hear anything. I saw on videos after the fact that there were some cops with bullhorns, but I didn't hear anything.
Okay.
That doesn't mean it didn't happen.
So to your knowledge, you're in the crowd, chanting your demands, calling out Hakeem's name, and then tear gas comes, and then rubber bullets come.
I don't know if there were rubber bullets. I'm not sure if there were rubber bullets, but there certainly were batons.
I'm sorry, the batons came out. Okay. There was a moment where you yourself were taken down
Oh, the chocolate.
by an officer.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, I actually had walked home because when I originally showed up on the scene, I was like, I was in a dress. So I actually walked home to put on some pants and some gym shoes. And when I came back, I immediately got a whiff of the tear gas, and I saw cops with batons hitting people. And then I saw in front of me somebody being taken down. I couldn't tell who it was, but I saw 3 or 4 cops on this person, and I saw their knee on that person's neck, and I just livid at the audacity, but also very terrified for that person.
So what did you do?
So I was screaming, get off of him, get off of him, get off of him, get your knee off his neck. And so while this is happening, there's a group of cops who decide to, they're in riot gear, by the way. So there's a group of cops who decide to surround that interaction to block not only me, but other protesters from seeing what's happening. And then while that happens, another line of cops tries to push us back. They're pushing us back, they're pushing us back. They're screaming, get out of here, go home, screaming, I am at home, I live here. This is my neighborhood, I don't have to go nowhere. So I don't. And, next thing I know, I'm grabbed by the neck and I'm on the ground.
Was that the moment that they arrested you?
When I'm on the ground, they take my keys, which I always have like this. So they take them off of me, and then they put my hands behind my back, and they put the zip ties on me, and then they hand me over to some guy. I'm assuming he was a plainclothes cop. He just has regular jeans on, a blue t-shirt that says Detroit in the shape of a gun. and he's kind of dragging me willy-nilly through San Juan, and they're all yelling, all the cops are yelling at each other. Where are we putting them? Where are we putting them? Where do we take them? Do we have a bus? And so they have no plan or a direction. And I'm yelling at this cop, and I go, okay, your chief left you out here by yourself. He told you to charge the crowd. You don't have a plan. And then I say, do they pay you enough to defend murderers? And he jerks me by my arm and he says, yes, they do. And shut the fuck up before I make sure you're the next victim. So, at this point, I'm like, okay, y'all don't have a plan. You have no identification on. You're just dragging me, like literally just dragging me up San Juan. They have no idea where they're going, where they're placing us. And then he takes me over to some cops. And they're like, stand here. And so I'm standing there. And then they're arguing about where to put us. And they end up throwing me and someone else in the back of a squad car. And then 5 minutes later, they take us out the squad car. And we're standing again. And then eventually a bus shows up. And they walk us about 2 blocks over to put us on the bus.
You say us, how many people were arrested in that day, in your opinion?
I'm sorry, but I was just taking so many arrests this summer. I think on that, was it 5 or 7 of us? It was 5 or 7. I'm sorry, I really don't. I think 5.
Now, you've been connected since that day to the family of Hakim Littleton, is that correct?
Yes.
And you didn't know Hakim,
No.
but you are very familiar with the fight for justice for Black lives, aren't you?
Yes.
And is that why you've still been in contact with his family to help them seek that justice?
Yes.
Is there anything that you can tell this court today, that includes his family, that you believe needs to happen in order for them to truly and finally receive justice in this matter?
I want to say, first, thank you to the Littleton family, because the courage and the boldness that it takes to fight this fight, the courage and the boldness that it takes to stand up so publicly and to call out the hypocrisy and the racism and the lies of the police department and the mayor and the state should not be underestimated, should not be understated. And I think that's really important. The other thing that I want to say is that the Littleton family is an amazing family. But even if they weren't, that wouldn't make this okay. And so we heard earlier about how amazing Hakim Littleton was, and I'm sure he was. But even if he wasn't, I would be out there, and people would be there to say, the police don't get to shoot you in the back of your head. But the Littleton family is they hard as they make them. And in the face of this, there's so much grief and so much pain. They're willing to fight this fight, and it's not just about justice for Hakim. When you talk to them, it's not. It's about what the future looks like for young Black and brown people walking through this city and walking through this nation. And so it's important for us as a people and as a community to have conversations about what it looks like to unequivocally stand up in defense of Black and brown life, and to say, we stand up for Black and brown lives whenever they are under attack, under any circumstances. And so we should take the lead of the Littleton family, because what they're doing is so important. It's so important to us getting liberation in this country.
Thank you, Nakia. At this time, we are going to view for ourselves a very painful painful moment. The moment where Hakim, he didn't just have his life taken. He was executed, ladies and gentlemen. And you're going to see that for yourselves. The video of that painful moment will then be followed by an analysis of the moment by our own Brother Mark Anthony.
If you need a break, because you're kind of going.
While we're getting that set up, is Paul Jackson here? Oh, okay.
You want it higher?
On the same day, Detroit Police Chief James Craig presented police videos of the incident. As police officers approach, Hakim digs for his gun. He appears to fire the gun towards a policeman and appears to be tackled by that policeman. It's unclear whether Hakim fired additional shots. The video shows that he raises his head and appears to look around. The video then shows Hakim on the ground on his stomach, straddled by a policeman. He is still alive. The police officers are not in danger. An arrest would have been possible at this point, and Hakim would still be alive. Chief Craig outlined the details of the incident in the following manner. He tells us that a total of 8 shots were fired in 5 seconds. 4 shots by Hakim, and a total of 4 shots by 3 police officers.
But 8 shots fired in 5 seconds. 8 shots fired in 5 seconds. 4 fired by 3 officers. 1 officer fired 2 shots. 1 officer fired 1 shot, and another fired 1 single shot. And then 4 shots fired by the suspect.
Fucking Richard, go, man. Shot fired!
At what point is Hakim first struck by a gunshot? Was he shot as he was falling to the ground? How close are the officers to Hakim's body? How many times was he wounded? Chief Craig reported that Hakim was struck 4 times including one shot to his head.
I want to take note, at some point you see what appears to be an officer kicking something that was the suspect's gun. That's, when you saw the kicking motion, he was actually kicking the gun away from the reach of Mr. Littleton.
The chief said also that 3 officers were involved in the killing. How many police officers do you count in the scene? How many appear to be pointing their guns at Hakim? Does it appear to you that the officers' lives are in danger? Do you think the officers had the option to arrest Hakim rather than kill him? Given all these questions and given the police legacy of misinformation and cover-ups of excessive force, how credible is the chief's report? An independent, impartial investigation will answer all these questions. In this global uprising against police violence, we Detroiters cannot sit by passively and have our young black men die in the streets of excessive police force. Their lives matter. Black lives matter. Our community demands an investigation of this killing of Hakim Littleton, thereby offering our support to the Littleton family and joining ranks with thousands in Detroit and around the world to bring an end to police killings.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Fancher, and I'm the staff attorney for the Racial Justice Project of the ACLU of Michigan. I want to thank and congratulate all of you for participating in this People's Tribunal. You at this point have viewed the video and you've taken note of all of the things that have been pointed out by our coalition, including the last shot that was fired into Hakim Littleton's head, bullet number 10. When most of us who are not in law enforcement look at something like that, we conclude, as you have, or as you soon will, that what took place was an execution, a killing, a purposeful killing of a human being, notwithstanding anything that he may have done or not done. This was an effort to kill a man by placing a bullet in his head. And when we see that, we have any number of different emotional reactions, but when we ask the question, what is to be done, there are many people who would say, well, what has to happen is that this needs to go into the criminal justice system. The officer or officers responsible need to be prosecuted, and they need to be charged with the most serious crime that they can be charged with, and they need to be punished to the maximum. And for those who believe that they will get justice by allowing the criminal justice system to take care of matters like this, they need to reflect on a few things. One is that we have seen any number of instances nationally where there have been police killings of black people, armed and unarmed, that in the civilian mind were unjustified, were criminal acts. And yet, either there were no consequences for the officers, or the consequences were of a such that were not believed by most people to be appropriate given the nature of the crime and its seriousness. We've seen here in Michigan, in the city of Saginaw, in 2012, one of the worst instances of police violence that went unpunished. In that year, a 49-year-old homeless black man named Milton Hall was in a store and had an argument with a cashier. He suffered from a mental disability, and he went out into a parking lot where there were no cars, no pedestrians, no other human beings within his immediate vicinity. And he began to go on a rant. He was shouting at the sky, he was screaming and carrying on, and they called the police and said that this man needed to be taken into custody. this man needed to be dealt with. He was out there having a breakdown, that he was on a rant. And 8 Saginaw police officers arrived, and after talking with him or dealing with him for 30 minutes, finally brought in a canine officer with a dog. And this officer loosened the leash that he had on the dog, and the dog began to bark and snap at Milton Hall, approached him, and as he did, Milton Hall pulled out a pocket knife, and he said, "Let the effing dog go. I'm not scared of the dog." And when he did that, the canine officer pulled the dog back in, out of the reach of Milton Hall. He never was within Milton Hall's wingspan. Milton Hall never could have done anything to the dog. But it was at that point that the officers raised their rifles, and they shot more than 40 bullets at Milton Hall, executing him firing squad style. And what makes this worse is that all of this was captured on dashboard cam. In other words, the video surveillance camera that's mounted in the police car captured all of it, every last minute of it, in real time. And after the prosecutor looked at this video footage, he concluded that there were no grounds to bring charges against the officers who killed Milton Hall. He concluded that what these officers did was to act in self-defense, if for no other reason than to protect the dog's life. It gets worse, because the U.S. Department of Justice began an investigation of this case that lasted more than a year. And at the end of that time, they concluded that federal civil rights criminal charges could not be brought against the officers, essentially because they believed that they could not win the case. And so there was never justice for Milton Hall in the criminal justice system. These officers were never criminally prosecuted. And so it makes us ask questions. When we have situations like this one involving Hakim Littleton, where is justice to be found? For those who still think that perhaps the criminal justice system is a route that can be taken, and that there can be appropriate justice for him through the criminal justice system by charges being filed against the officer who fired the bullet and took his life. We need to know a little bit about how the criminal law works. Anytime there's a crime, the law requires that there are at least 2 elements to it. One is that there has to be some mental intent on the part of the person who commits the crime. In addition, there has to be some act that the person undertakes, or takes some action to try and accomplish the crime. There's an intent element and there's an act element. And there has to be what the law calls concurrence between these two. In other words, if someone kills someone, but they don't have the mental intent, they don't intend to kill anybody, it's just that they perform the act, and they don't have the necessary intent, then there is no crime that has been committed. If, on the other hand, someone intends to kill someone, but they don't do anything to actually carry out that crime, then likewise, there is no crime that's been committed necessarily, or at least not the crime that's contemplated with respect to an intentional homicide. But even if you have the intent and the act, the criminal law requires further elements to be satisfied before there is some potential for a finding of guilt. If we look at the Hakim Littleton killing, we would think that an execution of a human being would warrant the most serious homicide charge that we can bring. In the state of Michigan, that would be first-degree murder. The law on the books says that in order for first-degree murder to have been committed, there has to have been a willful, deliberate, and premeditated killing. And if there is guilt of that crime, then the punishment is life in prison without parole. We have to get a little bit more detailed if we're going to satisfy those requirements, because there is a definition that the courts have given to the elements of premeditation and deliberation. If there's premeditation, it presumes that the person who's done the killing has thought about the killing beforehand. that it's something that they didn't just do on impulse, that they actually thought about it and decided that that's something that that's a crime that they're going to commit. With respect to deliberation, it refers to measuring and evaluating the major facets of the crime and making a choice about what's going to happen. All of this suggests that anybody who's going to be found guilty of first-degree murder has done a lot of thinking about it. Not only that, but the courts have gone so far as to say that there has to, in most cases, have been the passage of time between the formation of the initial intent to kill somebody and the actual killing itself. And more specifically, there are courts that have said that the person who commits the killing has to have had an opportunity to have taken a quote-unquote second look. In other words, that means that after they thought about and made the plan to kill somebody, that they had an opportunity to think about it again. And that this was actually the product of a real serious and protracted thought. So by this time, you begin to see some of the challenges that would be presented if first-degree murder charges were filed against this officer who fired the 10th shot into Hakim Littleton's head. A defense attorney representing this officer would be able to use the premeditation and deliberation elements of the crime as very vigorous defenses on behalf of his or her client. He or she would be able to say this officer was acting in the heat of the moment, that all kinds of things happened very unexpectedly and very suddenly, that Hakim Littleton himself had kicked off a sequence of events that had all of the officers on edge, and that this officer who fired this 10th shot into his head was doing it without any premeditation, was doing it without any deliberation, who was acting on impulse and just pulled the trigger because he was caught up in the heat of the moment. Because of the way things go in courts, this could very likely be an effective defense on behalf of that officer. And it raises questions for those who are civilians, who are not law enforcement, and particularly for those of us who are Africans, about whether this is a truthful system, a truthful process. Because we understand that these crimes do not happen in isolation in the way that the law suggests that they do. The law presumes that a crime is taken on its own merits, and that the individual who's accused of the crime has to be judged solely on what this particular individual does on this particular occasion with respect to this particular incident. There are many of us who see things quite differently. We understand that particularly when there are crimes committed by police officers against black people in America, that those crimes do not occur in a vacuum, that they do not occur in isolation, that there is a racial, historical, and social and sociological context in which they happen, that there is a pre-existing racial culture within law enforcement as an institution that suggests to police officers who come into contact with black people on the streets that they are dealing with someone who is dangerous. They go onto the street presuming that it is necessary for them to contain and control a wild and out-of-control population, using violence without much hesitation at all, already forming the intent before they even get in their scout car, their squad car, to go out and patrol, that it's probably going to be necessary for them to get violent with these people because based on the stereotypes and based on law enforcement culture, black people are always violent and they're always dangerous and they present a danger to the police officers. That's the context that we understand, but it's not a context that the courts always use when they approach these cases. Sometimes they're even prohibited from doing it for evidentiary reasons. And so it looks on the face of it, based on what we know from our practical experience and common sense, that relying upon the criminal justice system to obtain justice in this instance and in many others like it is not always going to yield the type of justice that we would like to see. And that's why it's so important that events like this one, the People's Tribunal, happen. Because what is an issue is something bigger, broader, and beyond what happened to Hakim Littleton. If we were to somehow, by some miracle, succeed in having a prosecution brought against the officer who was involved in this, and if we were to obtain a guilty verdict, and if he were to be sentenced and punished appropriately, I think we all know that that would not serve as that much of a deterrent to other law enforcement officers who might also be inclined to commit crimes against black people. That yes, this one officer might be punished, but within a very short period of time, there's some other brother, some other sister who's also going to be shot, who's also going to be the victim of excessive force, who's going to be brutalized or in some other way humiliated. That it's a bigger and broader problem than just this one officer who killed Hakim Littleton. And for that reason, we have to be engaged in a struggle that's much broader and more comprehensive in order to ensure justice, not just for Hakim Littleton, but for all of us who are at risk of being victims of law enforcement. And so the more that people understand the contradictions, the more that they're engaged in attacking those contradictions and organizing and mobilizing for full-scale removal of the existing system and replacement of one that yields real justice, the closer we will be to achieving the type of community, achieving the type of prospects for real justice that all of us want to see. So this tribunal can be a good first step. This tribunal offers the opportunity to take a critical look at what the system offers to those who have been victimized by police violence, and then to compare and contrast that with what's really needed. And to that extent, reviewing this case, proposing a crime to be charged that is appropriate, and then reaching a result that we believe, as members of the community, is a just result, is a good thing to do. And so again, I congratulate you and thank you for the work that you're doing in connection with this matter.
Wow. Well, I don't think any of us came into this building or are watching from home undecided about what actually took place and what charges should be brought. But if you were undecided, I'm pretty sure after those two compelling videos, you no longer are. At this time, I'd like to call to the witness stand Attorney Jeff Edison. Jeff Edison is an attorney with the National Conference of Black Lawyers, a human rights activist, and a legendary defense attorney, and one of my mentors in Bagas. Thank you, Jeff. Jeff, I've removed my mask. Folks online could not hear me very well. I'll ask you to do the same. Thank you. I'd like to talk to you about the history of policing in the United States.
Can you tell me historically what has been the function of policing in this country?
Thank you for that initial question. I think it's very important that we put the current conditions in a historic perspective. And when we look at the history of Africans in the United States and America, we know that the notions and concepts and principles of what we call policing today are rooted in the enslavement of African people. From the very onset of Africans' existence in America, there was and has been a continuous resistance to the captivity and oppression of African people by the government apparatus, beginning with enslavement. And so the response to the resistance to captivity was a need on the part of the governing authorities to exert some type of control and an apparatus to suppress the resistance that Africans had. And certainly Africans were always exercising their right to self-determination and for freedom. Not only Africans who were enslaved, but also the indigenous people of this land, the native, sometimes referred to as Native Americans or Native Indians, but certainly the indigenous people who were here when the settlers came to dominate and to take their land. And so although initially the apparatus was not called police, there were different names that were given to them in terms of militias, in terms of slave patrols, in terms of paddy patrols, as sometimes they were called. But these organized armed groups that had the authority of the government, of the state apparatus, were used to enforce enslavement, particularly enslavement. And there was a series of legislation or codes that the colonies had created, sometimes referred to as slave codes and various names. But these laws were in place to keep Africans dominated and controlled. And this was like dating back to the 1600s and 1700s. Oftentimes when we talk about enslavement, we are focused on the 1800s, but certainly the need to control the African population existed from the very time we arrived on these shores. And so you had these colonies that created these different codes, as they were referred to exercise control and to restrict the movement of Africans and to suppress Africans' efforts to liberate themselves. And to give you just an example of slave codes and what they were enacted to do, I want to reference some slave codes in the colony of Virginia dating back to 1680. And this is only one example or illustration of what these codes and how oppressive the conditions were at the time. And I quote, It shall not be lawful for any Negro or other slave to carry or arm himself with any club, staff, gun, sword, or any other weapon of defense or offense, nor to go or depart from his master's ground without a certificate from his master, mistress, or overseer, and such permission not to be granted but upon particular and necessary occasion. So right there, as a preface, it was an overarching mechanism for control, and it continued. In every Negro or slave, and I don't know how you can notice how they made a distinction. So even if they say Negro or slave, to imply that even Africans who were not enslaved had to some extent, be under the auspices of the slave code. And every Negro or slave so offending, not having a certificate, as aforesaid, shall be sent to the next constable, police, who is hereby enjoined and required to give said Negro 20 lashes on his bare back, well laid on, and so sent back to his master, mistress, or overseer. So just automatically you get lashed for not having this certificate 20 times. And that any Negro or other slave shall absent himself, let me rephrase that, and that if any Negro or other slave shall absent himself from his master's service and lie hid and lurking in obscure places, committing injuries to the inhabitants, or shall resist any person or persons that shall have any lawful authority be employed to apprehend and take the said Negro, that then in case of such resistance, it shall be lawful for such person, that person with the authority to apprehend. It shall be lawful for such person or persons to kill the said Negro or slaves so lying out and resisting. So just as an essential and important part of the conditions of enslavement as being chattel slavery, as being property, as not being any of your humanity being recognized, we were at the whims and discretion of those folks who were given the authority to exercise control over us. That was, in essence, the police. Not called that, but the police. And so, early on, we had that relationship. It's embedded in the historical memory of both Africans and the settler Europeans. And so as time continued, if you take it up to the inception of the Constitution, we know that within the Constitution itself did not recognize humanity of African people. We know there were provisions of 3/5 in terms of how they decided who was going to be represented in their legislatures, that property owners had to, were conferred the right to count the property, African people, as 3/5 of an individual. We know in the Constitution that it enshrined and allowed the continuation of the trade of African people. We know further in the Constitution there were provisions that, under what they call the fugitive slave provisions, that allowed, if an African had the good fortune to escape bondage and go to another territory, then if they would send out the slave patrols or the police to capture you and bring you back to bondage and enslavement. So from the very inception, you had this relationship between Africans and Europeans and those who were in control. And so there has always been a resistance. Africans never just accepted their status of, or this relationship of domination by the Europeans. And then as we look into the 1800s, the landowners and slaveholders became particularly afraid when you had a brother, David Walker, in the early 1830s, or actually the late 1820s, when he wrote what we commonly refer to as the David Walker's Appeal, where David Walker, being an enslaved African, put out a call for resistance and to violently resist, if necessary, the individual's enslavement. And one of the quotes in his appeal to fellow Africans, he was saying that one good black man can put to death 6 white men. And it just made the slave owners crazy with that. So they began to organize themselves to repress resistance, repress rebellions, and to exert more control over the enslaved Africans, and that is basically these organized groupings were called militias at that time, and also has been referenced different forms of slave patrols. And so as we move forward, after enslavement, during the time of so-called Reconstruction in the 1870s, where you saw free Africans being able to engage in some self-determination in terms of taking control over institutions of their lives, being elected to office, there was a serious backlash by the southern landowners, because now they had lost labor, and so they had to devise another mechanism of control over the free Africans. And so they came up now with what was called, they just changed the name from slave codes to black codes, and various institutionalized methods to exert control over this free African population. And you have these various mechanisms wherein if you were, there was a violation of a code, a black code, then the constables and the law enforcement mechanism in the particular area could arrest you, could arrest the African, jail the African, and then lease the jailers would lease the individuals back to the landowners to work the fields and to do what was necessary to benefit those landowners and slave owners, or former slave owners. And so the people who were used for that were the police mechanism to exercise the control over our people. And so now, and they had various what they call vagrancy laws, where the constable would just see you and say, well, where you going? Why are you here? And if you couldn't produce identification or at the whims of that officer, they would just say, well, you're in violation, snatch you up, and imprison you for a period of time. Just like what we commonly say now, driving while black, walking while black, going to the restaurant while black. It was the same concept where African people are criminalized. So you see an African, that notion that when you see an African, it automatically evokes some type of fear. It automatically invokes a perception of criminality. Or if you talk about criminality, that invokes a notion of African or blackness. And so those two together go and creates this police culture that we are witnessing now. And it's like that culture of policing that Mark talked about that kind of pre-exists in before any interaction between the police and the individual African on the street, whether it's a brother or a sister, because they have this preconceived notion that's embedded in police culture that some criminality is afoot, or that there's some degree of fear that is social interaction, whether it is real or not. It's that perception. And so that's why you always hear the police, first thing they say, well, I was in fear. In fear of what? The guy just got pulling the wallet out of his pocket. I just had a lighter in his hand. Just had a cell phone. And the brothers or sisters are killed. Now it's like being black while in bed, like with Breonna Taylor. You know, so those preconceived notions have a historic foundation that we deal with in contemporary times. And so now, as you come up through the 1900s, there's a move to militarize the police departments. So where there's the federal government is providing surplus military type equipment to local police departments to exercise control and domination over populations, particularly in the urban areas. And so you have this over-policing in black neighborhoods. You definitely can see a difference in terms of the type of policing that happens in the suburban areas or in the majority white areas as compared to populations that are predominantly black and African. You see in many, particularly in the last 20, 25 years, where many of the, of course, you know, with the imperial nature of the United States, they engaged in these wars across the planet. And so you have military personnel, soldiers who are out engaged in military combat situations in Iraq, in Africa, in the Middle East, and then they come back to the U.S. and the first place for employment is the police department. So you have these guys who are overpopulating the police department who are already predisposed to violence. They're predisposed to reacting violently. And so now many of police officers, I don't know the exact percentage, but many of them have military background. In fact, one of the folks back in the early 1900s, one of the military leaders coming back from war, was saying how he had to now create military type practices within the police department by saying that, well, we're at war with people again in our communities. And so kind of transposing his frame of mind of military activity to that of basic policing. The whole notion of to protect and serve has gotten lost with that over militarization mentality. And we see it every day. So there's a lot of talk now about now the federal government talking about all this violence in our urban cities. And so there's been a surge of police involvement and what we would call harassment with folks on a day-to-day basis. We know the federal government has this legend program where they're concerned about guns on the streets, so-called, and so we know there's a surge in police interaction with folks on the street. There's been a surge in arrest of black men and women in the city of Detroit for simple possession of firearms, both state and federally. Go down to the U.S. District Court for the Southern Division of Michigan, and there has been a surge and increase in the number of persons charged with weapon offenses. Here in the city of Detroit, there's a rise in the number of gun-related offenses, and that's because the police see cats on the street and stop. What they call fishing. They're going fishing. So trying to catch somebody. And they've been trained to understand what the legal basis to justify a stop. So they set that aside. They stop you, hey, come here, boy, or come here, over here. Pat you down, shake you down, and they happen to find a weapon. Then they shape their testimony to fit the little niches and say, well, I saw a bulge in his pocket. Or he bladed somewhere, he turned a particular way. And none of that occurred at all. They just shook the person down. They're not going out in the suburbs shaking down those white boys on the street at the same degree that they are in the city. And so that leads to different issues. And so the police are the first contact with Africans on the street. Then it's referred to, so we're being arrested disproportionately. Then we are going through the system. We're being charged by the prosecutor offices with this. You look across the nation with offenses disproportionate to Europeans, higher charges. We go to trial, and if there's convictions, we know there's disparities in the jury systems and in the judicial system, the way judges look at these cases, the way jurors look at these cases, and then if there is a conviction, you see a disparity in the type of sentencing that our people are getting as compared to European counterparts. So we know that there's an increase in, or there's a direct relation with the prison industrial complex. We know that since the 70s, the prison population has increased fourfold, and so all of this has a devastating impact on our communities that begins with the interaction with the police. And so that's where we are today.
Jeff, can you speak a little bit about how Black communities across the United States have tried to fight back against this very violence that you just described?
Well, there's always been a call for accountability and transparency. And here in Detroit, locally, at least, out of what has happened this summer, there's the Coalition for Police Transparency and Accountability. There is nothing new about police brutality and the killing of African population by the police. It's nothing new. We've been engaged in this struggle ever since we've been here, as I've stated. And so there's been efforts to, quote, reform. There's different forms of what has been referred to as community policing, where ideally you would want the police force to be a reflection of the community that it is policing. We know that's not the case here in Detroit now. Residency is not a requirement. Folks can come from wherever to and police a community. We know that creates a particular problem in terms of being able to relate. Oftentimes we know that a lot has to do with the officer's perception of the individual that they're dealing with, so that creates a problem. When they don't have the same background and frame of reference, there's been calls for citizen review boards where the community would have oversight, if you will, of complaints of police misconduct. And we should know that when we talk about police misconduct, we're just not talking about the very violent brutality of police killings or police beatings. Police misconduct occurs at a very basic, fundamental type of interaction, just from a police stop of your car. You know, a traffic stop can be traumatic and violent to a recipient who is verbally abused by that officer. Every time they come up and what you got in your car, get on out the car. You know, for no reason doing that. You know, subjecting you to all types of humiliation unnecessarily so, simply because the color of your skin. Police just like, I mean, you say everybody lies, but the police are sworn not only to perform their duty righteously, but they come to court and lie. You know, for no reason other than to put a case on someone. You know, and so those are forms of police misconduct that we never talk about. We just talk about when they beat you across the head or some of us are killed. But the actual terrorizing dynamic that is created by police is something that occurs on just simple traffic stops, or walking or being in a supermarket or at the mall and the police are there. I mean, terrorism impacts behavior. When you're terrorized, or the purpose of to terrorize someone is to affect the other person's behavior. I mean, you know, as Africans, we all might be just in a car cruising, minding our own business. As soon as we hear a siren behind us or lights start flashing, it creates and it evokes a particular traumatic experience. Like, damn, they have to be. Now they just cruise on by. know. But it's that reaction that's the result of the terror that we have experienced in any form prior to that instance. And so police terror is real. And when we complain about it and talk about it, it's not, well, get over it. You know, you're going to be all right. It's a serious dynamic that must be changed. And one of the issues, if not here, that we ultimately have to deal with is there's talk about reform. But reform of a system that has never been right is just trying to make it better when it never was intended to be righteous to us in the first place. So we have to be able to move to a place or space, as the term is referenced nowadays, a space where we can talk about true abolition of police and creating a dynamic where we can truly address behavior that needs to be addressed in a more holistic fashion, where everyone's humanity is recognized. Each of us, we are part of each other. And so we want to be able to not leave that dynamic out of it. If we just reforming something that's already bad from the beginning is not really going to serve our true interests as a people.
Thank you. My last question you just answered, and that was simply, is it possible to reform a body, an agency, a school of thought that was created in direct response to Black people resisting slavery, to Black people standing up for justice, to Black people simply fighting for liberation? And it sounds like your answer is no.
Yeah, ultimately, I mean, we have to deal with the conditions right now, but the ultimate certainly is no. And what we got to guard against, see, not only we have this, say for example, with Brother Hakim, and there's a particular dynamic in our community to say, well, he shot at somebody, you know, so they justified in doing what they did. Even though when you break it down, we know that he was subdued and that he was in no threat to anyone at the time he was executed. You still have that mentality out here that he was doing something wrong. And so because of our socialization over the years and decades of being traumatized, we as a people begin to think, well, some of this police conduct is acceptable and that is all right, but it's not. See, we got to kind of remember how it was before we had to deal with these police. I mean, you know, it's kind of, or how was it before we were snatched away from the bosom of Mother Africa? What were our communities like? You know, how did the Maroons in Jamaica, when they went into the mountains, how did they create their communities and provide for the safety and security and protection of the communities? You know, we have to chip away the socialization that we have endured over decades to recreate this new system of interacting with one another. It's one of the African principles and concepts of community and interaction is Ubuntu. I am because we are. We are because I am. That means there's an interconnectedness of everyone, that you're not separate. And so if there was an agency of policing, that the term policing, but being able to, if there was an agency to protect the community, then it has to be based on concepts and principles that we are one, not separate. You know, it's not me against them. You know, it's not that we're at some antagonistic relationship, but rather a communal and collective dynamic where we all rise together, not based on individualism, where one person can achieve whatever he or she may at the expense of the collective and the community. And so we want to be able to bring those type of humane and dynamics to this new vision of protecting our community. But I don't know how we just reform the police, and the very foundation of policing is antithetical to the well-being of African people in America.
Thank you so much, Brother Jim.
Thank you. So let me, if you want to follow or try to research and there's all types of sites that are gathering statistics and data about policing. There's one site, mappingpoliceviolence.org. There was a book that was put out, I didn't realize it was so long ago, but this is in 1999. Stolen Lives Killed by Law Enforcement, and it's documents the individuals by state who were killed by the police. And but you know, we can't tolerate it at all.
Thank you so much. At this time, I'd like to call Sister Diane Bukowski to the stand. As she makes her way up, I'll share with you that Diane is an award-winning journalist who is currently the publisher of Voice Detroit. She's a longtime researcher in police policies and practice and a longtime activist in Detroit in the movement against police brutality and in the movement for Black lives. Thank you, Diane. Thank you. Diane, you've watched the video.
Yes.
You've also watched an analysis of not just what happened in that video, but of criminal law, the elements of murder, in particular first-degree murder.
Yes.
And you watched the behavior of those officers in that video. Mm-hmm. With your background and experience, can you explain the behavior of the police killers in the video?
Well, basically, that comes automatically to the police from what the cases that I've covered over the years of police killing by police. These are some of the cases that I've covered, both with the Michigan Citizen and Voice of Detroit since 1995. All the people that have been killed by the police. This one, people probably really remember little Ayanna Jones. In fact, in terms of intent, her grandmother, Bertilla Jones, was viciously criticized and demonized along with the rest of her family during the trials of the officer that killed her, Joseph Weekley, and also the opposite trials of her father and uncle. What really came out, she was criticized for saying that the police came to kill. Now, that was something a neighbor said, and that's something that she repeated when she testified in court. And she was broadly criticized for that. The narrative in most of the media was that, in most of the mainstream media, was that, no, this was just an accident. How could an officer really intend to kill a little 7-year-old child? In fact, I covered the entire trials of all the parties involved. I covered Joseph Weekly's trial, which lasted, through 3 different trials actually. And during that trial, there was one event that stood out to me that confirmed what Myrtilla Jones, the grandmother, was saying. That was when the medical examiner took the stand, and there was questions about the bullet that went into Ayanna's head, and whether it was close range or far range. The medical examiner said as an afterthought, as he was leaving the stand, he said, well, it could have been a contact gunshot wound. Now, Officer Weekly, when he walked in there, he was the head of that team that killed Ayanna Jones. He was the first one there. He had just got in the door. Her head was right by the door when she was killed. And she was leaning up on the couch in their little poor small house. And right there, he put his gun up against her head and killed her. Now, he may not have known she was a 7-year-old child, but he did see a black person's head there from the hair. And he felt that was a threat to him. There was no threat in that house. Her father and mother, her little brothers, her grandmother, her great aunt, cousins. There were numerous people staying in that house because they were poor and had no other place to stay. They gravitated to the grandmother. And that, to me, typifies the attitude and the horrendous uproar that ensued on that. I was just horrified. I went straight to that house when I found out in the morning. But to realize that people in the city, including in the media, could flock to demonize a little child, even to the extent that when the trial of Joseph Weekly was going on, the defense brought up Facebook photos showing her cousins, her young cousins, which never should have been admitted in court. They were allowed in by Judge Cynthia Gray Hathaway, showing them with guns. And no evidence was introduced showing who took the photos, who the photos were of, were the guns real or not. And they were even passed out. They copied them out, passed out large copies of the photos to the jury during the trial. This was typical of the attitude that police have, that, these communities, that the family, even one of the reporters, George Hunter from the Detroit News, told me, well, I saw one of Ayanna and her little brothers giving gang signs. I said, I was just stunned. And this is mainstream media reporter who reports on the police all the time. So that whole criminalization, I was glad to see this in the River Wise, because this reminded me of the old coalition that Gloria and Ev and I were part of, the Stop Police Brutality, repression, and the criminalization of a generation. It's not just one generation that's been criminalized. It's generations going back, as Attorney Edison said, to slavery days. And cases that I've covered specifically with regard to that issue of gangs, I know that was raised with regard to Hakim, that the police tried to say, oh, he was a gang member, he was involved in some shooting a couple of weeks before that, which was not true. But that was how they tried to portray him. And that anytime young people come together, young black folks come together, that's considered organizing. They're frightened about that. They don't want to see people gathering together because they figure they're up to something. They're afraid. And now it could be gathering in any kind of way, just gathering to talk to each other, gathering in a club, gathering, in any kind of fashion, but that's considered a gang. So they criminalized Hakim by saying he was in a gang. There's a case that I'm covering right now. A young man that's in prison was sentenced to life without parole with the same narrative that he was in a gang called the Hustle Boys. This is Darrell Ewan, whose story I've covered quite a bit in The Voice of Detroit, and I'm just putting it up now. The Court of Appeals just recently granted a new trial for him. Well, it's the fourth time a court has granted a new trial. 8 judges have said there should be a new trial in his case because the jury was contaminated when they brought in evidence, like in Ayana's case, Facebook photos and other internet evidence that they were not supposed to do, that they were told by the judge they could not do, and basically decided that Darrell and his co-defendant were part of a gang, and they discussed gang signs, gang hierarchies, all that kind of thing during jury deliberations. In this case, there was a very brave juror that came forward and testified about what happened, and it was that was just stunning to see that could have been allowed. But that type of thing is perpetrated by the police. They had a police expert that they wanted to testify at the trial. And when she was being vetted by the judge, Terry Graves was her name, and she was supposed to be a police expert on gangs. Her only training came from looking at Facebook photos, looking up research on the internet about gangs. She didn't take any courses in the criminal justice system or anything like that. So that's the whole attitude that police have, that they're trained to have, that's fostered in the police department, that's fostered across the country, and in the United States and other countries that are dominated by Friends of the United States. So that basically is, to say that Hakim was a member of a gang. He wasn't doing anything except walking down the street. As people said, he was in fear of his life, basically just existing in this system. And justifiably so, as the previous speakers have pointed out. And so, anyway, and there's another case I'll just briefly describe that I've been covering of a lifer who's been in prison since 1976 named Ricky Rimmer Bay. He was 20 years old, as Hakim was, when he was framed up. And when you talk about the police killing people, they don't just kill them by murdering them. They kill them by sending them to die in prison too, and that's a particularly vicious form of murder when you come down to it. To store somebody away for life, and just say they're not worth anything. They have to go into the horrendous conditions in the prison. But he was framed up for being a member of a gang. But basically, what happened was the real gang was the Detroit police in this situation. It was the Detroit police. It was an officer named Sergeant James Harris who had been with the unit called Stress. This was a black officer in Stress. And he testified he was the chief investigative officer in his case, and he had gone to Ricky Rimmer at the time to ask him to use the members of his association. For the lack of a better word, I don't like to call them gangs, because a lot of times people just organize into what they call gangs in order to get organized for protection or survival, some kind of way. And he had asked him to sell drugs for him. Now, this officer, James Harris, was later discovered. He was sent to prison for 30 years shortly after that, because he had been dealing drugs in the city, protecting international drug dealers coming into Detroit and basically destroying the whole city with their drugs. The crack epidemic, all of that, the heroin, every drugs that have been brought into the city. The police have always been part of that. And when Ricky refused to do that, he said he wouldn't do that. That's when Ricky said, well, I knew he was gonna do something to me. He was either gonna have me killed or he was gonna send me to prison for life. And that's what happened. And he's still fighting for his freedom. So, I know I've gone on kind of long, so.
Okay, this is an informal
Okay.
question and answer session. Could the officers that we saw in that video have checked each other and made sure that Hakeem did not take a life, subdue him, get the weapon away from him, and arrest him without killing him?
They definitely could have done that. That's clear from the video that we saw. That he was lying on the ground, he'd already been wounded, and he was still alive. But the question becomes, why were those officers there? Why was that whole gang of cops, as Hakim's uncle called them? He said, when they asked him about whether Hakim was in a gang, he said the real gang is the cops. There was like at least a dozen cops out there. They were flanking him on one side, and when you look at that video, there's another part that where you can't see the cops because they're behind the bushes. That's the two videos that you see, and you can see him looking off to the side there, to those other cops. Now, there was a part of that video that I believe, and when I talked to Hakim's uncle, Asir Al-Munra, he also remembers seeing it, where you can see the cops pulling their gun. And that's what he saw. He saw the cop pulling his gun. They were crouched down, waiting to arrest this young Darnell Sylvester, I think was his name. Why were they there? This young man only had a warrant out for a minor drug offense in North Dakota. They said he had a federal warrant. I researched it. It was in North Dakota. He went to the magistrate. He was seen in front of a magistrate in the federal court in Detroit, and they released him on a $10,000 bond. Now, what horrible crime had he committed that allowed the police, that said the police had to get out there with this military force? It was a gang squad. It was actually a gang squad. And, what justified that? There was no reason for them to be there in the first place. If they wanted to serve that warrant, they could have done it without a gang squad.
You just brought up an interesting point, justification.
Mm-hmm.
Police Chief James Craig stated to the media within hours of Hakim's murder, before any investigation was conducted, that the killing was justified.
Mm-hmm.
Now, typically there is an investigation that explores all facts and circumstances surrounding a death before it's concluded that a killing was justified, rather than jumping to the conclusion that it was justified. What kind of training do these officers receive in order to equip them with the tools they need to de-escalate situations such as this one, rather than shoot first, ask questions later, and then scream it was justification?
Well, that's a good question. During the trial of Joseph Weekly, there were officers that testified. In fact, it was pretty impressive, the number of people that testified that were trained not to put their finger on the trigger when they pull their gun, unless they intend to shoot. There was a firearms expert there that testified that he used the rifle, the assault weapon, it was an assault weapon that Weekly used when he killed that little girl, that he threw it, he tested it to see if it could be fired accidentally. He threw it everywhere in the room he was in. He tested it every way he could to see if it could be fired accidentally, and he said no. But that jury still, basically the prosecution and the judge, Cynthia Gray Hathaway, and the defense conspired to get that cop off. So there is some evidence that they're trained, in terms of what they're supposed to do and not do, but the mentality still exists there, despite the training, that would allow somebody like Joseph Weekly, who was basically, was known. He was on the first 48. He was part of the Detroit, I forget the other term for the A&E show. But he and other officers in the Detroit police were featured as stars on this show, which was basically a show about police invading the black community, invading people's homes, arresting them, and in this case, killing them. But, they didn't quite expect it to go that far, I guess. At least the A&E people didn't. But this is what they do. Despite whatever training they have, the mentality is there.
Does that mentality come from the top down?
I definitely believe that because James Craig has made it clear in interviews that he's had all over the country. He's featured on a right-wing national talk show all the time. And he's clearly in the camp of people in this country typified by our President Donald Trump, but going farther, to say that he's fostering this kind of mentality among the police. The way that he's attacked the protesters from Detroit will breathe is just incredible. I've covered some of their marches. I haven't been able to get to all of them. But from what I've seen, when they marched, they were peaceful. And that's what every observer that's trying to be fair has said. Is that they didn't bring weapons to the scene. They didn't attack anybody. It was the police that attacked them. They fired tear gas at them right away. So, and beat them, beat bystanders, such as the man that was downtown and tried to give shelter to some of the people that were getting beat up in Detroit will breathe. He was beat mercilessly. His face was just pulverized. And that's the mentality they have. They do feel like they're an invading army. As Attorney Edison was pointing out, the number of police that are from the military originally. That's the mentality this country inculcates into them.
My last set of questions for you. They go in the direction of transparency. So we've heard testimony all afternoon about the police officers, the reason why they were there that day, how their actions were wholly unjustified, how they could have responded differently, and how Police Chief James Craig, within hours, produced one of the videos in an effort to be transparent, so he said. To your knowledge, have all of the body cams from all of those officers that were out there that day been released?
Definitely not. As far as I know, there's another video that's never been released. When you see the first frame of the film that we just saw, you see a young woman that's leaving the scene horrified. She's in a reddish-orange shirt, and she's going away from the scene horrified. And I noticed when I looked up, it's just a flash, but when a certain part of for a couple seconds, you can see what she's holding in her hand. She's holding a video camera. She was videoing what was going on. What happened to that young woman? Where's her video camera? They probably caught her and destroyed it, but it's clear to me that what they did was they cobbled together a couple of the videos to feature the one frame where Hakim is allegedly pulling out a gun, which I believe, obviously, that he did. He had seen that the police were armed and pulling their guns on him. He was terrified for his life, was the reason he pulled the gun, if he did pull the gun. And he had reason to be, because the history of police murdering people across this country, well, it's been going on for 400 years, but people are certainly much more conscious about it now. And anyway.
So they have not all been released?
No, they definitely altered that video, cobbled it together whatever way they could to blame Hakim after they killed him, because they knew they had executed him. They knew that.
To your knowledge, in an effort to be, again, transparent, have all of the police reports been released?
Nothing. That's another issue that myself and our legal consultant from the Voice of Detroit has been raising, is the fact that the people have a right to see not only the names of all the police officers that were involved, not just the one that killed him, but all of them, because why were they all there? Their backgrounds, to bring out what other incidents, similar incidents they may have been involved in under Brady versus Maryland. That people need to know this for their own protection in the community. Those cops are still out there roaming the community and still present a danger to the entire community of Detroit, particularly to young black people and black people of all ages, but particularly young black people. And they're the reason people are living in terror.
Thank you so much for that perspective, Diane. I appreciate you. The last witness that I'm going to bring up for today, Brother Paul Jackson, an activist leader with Frontline Detroit, and also a protester with Detroit Will Breathe. Thank you for being here, Paul. Can you share with the court your knowledge of the Detroit Police Department and share in a historical context their presence within the black community?
So, I mean, to my knowledge, Detroit Police Department was actually founded in the 1800s to respond to a race riot that was actually bands of white folks who had been stirred by what was then a white supremacist newsletter or gazette known as the Detroit Free Press to attack black folks under the idea that there was new concessions being made to black folks to come to join labor unions to get jobs that were otherwise protected by white supremacy for white folks. And at that time, the police were formed to put down the rebellion, but they were only to really formed to put down any black resistance or black self-defense. And so they were, in many ways, the arming of already existing gangs of white terrorists, many times along ethnic lines, as we see around the country. Irish gangs are just armed against whatever other ethnic group is there. And in this case, it's Africans coming up from the South. That's the long view that, just of what I've read. And I heard other folks speak to that history playing out repeatedly, where folks who behave like gangs are actually sent into police but are being called or identified as criminal elements, or somehow folks who are cast or portrayed as subhuman, and they're to be domesticated and dominated and brought into submission to nearby white populations, or in broader sense to this structure that promotes white supremacy as a myth and as a goal.
Again, very consistent with the history of policing in this country for the last 400 years as it relates to black folks. Can you speak about your involvement in responding to the terror that comes from what we call the police department here in Detroit?
Yeah. So for me, it's been a journey of learning and unlearning, because one of the things that I think stands out to me is the ways in which what's truly abnormal is made to seem normal. What's truly unnatural, which is for people to accept abuse, accept domination, accept terror, for those people to live as if they're not under that condition, which is truly unnatural. And so for me, as a person who's been taught how to avoid or how to navigate or to behave in ways that say, prove somehow to you that I don't deserve this treatment, which we already know is inevitable, which is baked in before you were born, before you ever made a mistake, I've had to unlearn that. And a part of that is learning, taking up then resistance, or to assert that, no, I'm a person, and the people around me are people, no matter what the situation is. That's the floor on which we stand, that everybody involved is a person. And that we will not do anything to compromise that because of this fantasy, or really sick and twisted history and narrative that's put on us through the education system, that's put on us through education systems that criminalize, dehumanize our babies from very early on, to instill in them a sense of white supremacy and self-hatred very early on, and to say, no, I'm going to begin to behave and resist that. So for me, it's been like building community, organizing with communities that are focused on self-determination, from an early age, focused on food as self-determination, focused on housing as self-determination, a consciousness in the national history of our people as an act of self-determination, knowledge of self. That's been my ongoing involvement. And that's what, the long form trajectory which brings me to this day, to this moment, to stand in solidarity with the family of Hakim Littleton, to insist on that no matter what, in the face of all the smears and the lies and the repeating of old narratives about how he was supposed to behave. And I really want to stress the abnormal nature of people all over the world, where we seem to be one of the few people who's expected to accept invading armies walking up and down our streets. When Makia talked about the long guns, I mean, these were automatic, semi-automatic, military-grade assault rifles that were there at the moment of the initial contact. That this is how these gang squads arrive on your block, and we've heard a lot of this, so I won't repeat a lot of it, but the testimony about how anti-blackness makes that normal, that we're the one few people who are supposed to accept it on the planet. That that's our state and condition. That's the basic, that's the floor on which we stand. And I start to understand as somebody who, has had pets, that's how you move from that point of being a person to being an accessory to someone else's person, or being a pet, being an object. Is when a pet becomes a pet when they don't bite back. When they don't insist on, hey, you can't, the kids can't kick me no more. If you pull my tail, it's consequences. And once you get them to surrender that and to start going in under the table and going in back into their crate because your bad cousins are over, that's the pet. The food is right there. I always wonder why my dogs, they're 70 pounds, little bag of food, why I don't tear it open and just eat it. They sit and wait because they've been made a pet. They've been trained and conditioned to accept that as their floor on which they stand, their base level. And so when I saw what happened to Brother Hakim, I understood that they were insisting on the abnormal as normal, as the unnatural as natural. He was supposed to accept whatever fate lay and wait for his friend.
Talk about finding in your own life your footing to resist this type of thinking, to resist this training. Talk to me and tell this court, we have all been trained and conditioned to think exactly what you just testified to. But Hakim resisted that. Hakim studied his history. You heard testimony that Hakim was knowledgeable about his people in this country and was fearful, but was still resisting what was being put upon him along with his brothers and sisters. But we're here because we know that the end result of that resistance was his murder. What can you say to us to encourage the fight against police brutality, to encourage Black folks to continue resisting and not accepting what's being offered to us, but standing and offering to the world, to this country, who we are and what we are and what we stand to bring to it? What do you say to us?
Well, for me, in particular, what I saw when I watched the tape, for example, when I saw that moment, which was supposed to somehow force all of us back into this trance, this hypnosis of set you back to remember that this is normal. And the lies that were being spun around it, I realized how far Hakim had come. I could see, in that moment, you can see a lot of his family's love for his dignity. They didn't learn, it's obvious they didn't learn to love him as the lesser person who bows down and hangs their shoulders and gets beat. They insisted on loving the true him, the him that goes from ancestor to ancestor, generation from thousands of years, the ancient that was in him, the divine that was in him. And so what I offer to the fight is that we begin to know ourselves in that light. That if we were to survive by any other means, if we were to survive by compromising our own dignity, we're not really surviving. The body may live, but the soul which infuses it with that vibrancy, the difference between the eyes of someone on the cold slab in the morgue and the eyes of someone who's sitting in this room with fire, that's what he was insisting on. That he could have gone the rest of his life a zombie, demoralized, broken, made into a pet. And perhaps he would have survived and lived like many of the other people who just kind of go along, or beaten down, or abused. We are surviving in the body, but not in the spirit of who we truly are. And that's what inspired me, was that he'd rather die than accept, or he'd rather risk death in that moment, risk what you know is impending, than to lay down and go the way of many folks. And I also want to point out to the fact is that he didn't choose that outcome. They chose it. What he chose was to stand up for a friend. That's what I saw was quite clear. And the other thing that was what I meditated on over time was that with more people with Hakim Littleton's insistence and refusal to abandon his own dignity and personhood and that of his friend, we look at the names of people like Priscilla Slater. If Hakim is there when Priscilla is picked up, Priscilla might be here. If the spirit of Hakim is there to challenge and say no to what happens to Sandra Bland when she's picked up, Sandra Bland might be here. And to me, that's what defines someone who is willing to risk their life for other people, that thousands of other people may, from this moment forward, because of the actions of the family, to continue that spirit forward, may never have to suffer that disappearance, that arrest that has no answered questions, that there's no paperwork, appropriate paperwork filed, and now the person turns up dead in their cell and nobody knows. You don't know what happens when you let your friend be taken by these criminal elements, these corrupt forces who come through communities and harass young women, steal from people, sell. I've seen young folks tell me they got their phones stolen, $800 phone, money taken, money they saved to pay for something for their family, cars damaged. Destruction. People who talk about police raids where their couches are ripped open and the TV smashed on the ground. I've heard of physical and violent sexual assault by police officers raiding families on a routine basis in cities all across the country, anywhere I've lived and organized. So I don't think that, and I've said this before, that people need to spend a whole lot of time trying to get into what could have happened better, or what the civilian in the case could have done better, to accept as normal the behavior of the non-civilian, of the government officials who are walking around with guns. I think the choice, is your question, prompts me to think, the choice is on us to decide if people are going to have these kinds of options, fight or flight. Either I lay down and die and let you just abuse me, run through my community like you an OG, something, somebody, something that's just can't be challenged, can't be questioned. Or if I'm going to say, no, I'm putting my foot down here, you have to come in a different way. The choice, to me, opens up with what we're doing now. And I think, Hakim was murdered. As other people say, Hakim was executed. And I will say that what happened there was a climax of a very long, slow murder by society that allows, in small and great ways, police violence. Police violence is not just uniformed police violence. It's the choice to take funding out of schools and to fund police and surveillance technologies. It's the choice to close down community centers. It's the choice to suspend black boys and girls at incredible rates, to force them out of options, to force them out of the school to success pipeline into the school to prison pipeline. It's the choice to close down grocery stores and to force people to figure out how to scrape money off of gift cards and just little ways that we're constantly put in a position to survive by the most slim of margins, with the least dignity left, with the least of our humanity left. That's the slow beginning of the murder, the stranglehold, the suffocation. That climax is in this moment where you started to cut off, in an almost militaristic precision fashion, any other choice that a black person in America has to survive. So they're now facing the barrel of a gun saying, either I fight or I flee. It's very strategic. I'm going to take option Z, Y, W, V. Every option to you just got A and B. And for me, you know, I feel that as I live, I have to uphold, uplift, and honor Hakim because of, in the face of that very dire situation, what motivated him, what they'll never say, because they don't understand it, because it actually doesn't operate at the level of how they move in the world. What motivated him was love. Of course, Chief Craig and these folks, they can never say that. They can never look at him and his friend who was like a brother. We heard that testimony and say this is someone putting themselves on the line for a brother who's being accosted by a force that he understood could do anything to him. And so for me, that's the last piece that I think has to be elevated. Because when you try to paint somebody as somebody who's, they try to paint him as violent, that even after he's on the ground and he's been hit, he's still a threat. He's still, you heard this with Rodney King, you hear this with any black person. Well, he's superhuman, he can kill people from behind his back while he's laying. I don't see somebody motivated by this demonic contempt for human life, aside from the people in uniform. Who are they defending? Who in the frame do you see them protecting when they show up? I see somebody on the ground and the only person who would protect them. I see one person on the ground when the frame begins, and there's only one person who was there to serve that person and protect them with their life. His name is Hakim Littleton. And that amazes me. And that says to me that if we're going to survive as Africans in America, and as any people who are oppressed around the world, we're going to have to learn to understand when our enemies are our enemies, and to get rid of this fantasy, this fiction, that the people who beat us love us. That this abusive relationship with this nation is somehow good for us. It's advanced us. It's put us in a better position than our comrades in Africa. Once we get rid of that, once more people get rid of that notion, and you look at that frame, and it's not Hakim defending one person, but 10, 20 Hakims coming out their house saying, take your hands off of him. Okay, then I see a future in that. But until that consciousness becomes normal, and the idea that people can only deal with us through the barrel of a gun, we get rid of that notion that that's somehow normal. Until that happens, we need to understand that there is no future in that fantasy. And each and every one of us potentially has a bullet with our name on it until we resist, until we insist on resolving that unresolvable contradiction that says, I'm an African, I'm a person, I have a future, I have value, I have a right to live, and everyone around me has a right to live. And if I have to risk that living to insist on that right, if it's a civil right, it's an uncivil right, it must be done. That's the future. The future lies in the spirit of Hakim Littleton and his family, his beautiful family is here
I, at the risk of shedding tears, can't ask you any more questions. This is where I take role, this moderator hat, and I tip my hat to you, to all of you witnesses. This event has turned into something much more than I ever anticipated. I did not get into the weeds of your child, your boyfriend, your nephew's story because it was painful. And I think that's been the case with a lot of folks. But I also immediately rejected that narrative that was put out by Chief Craig, that Hakeem was a thug, that Hakeem was asking to be assassinated because he pulled a gun on an officer. But this, the last 3 hours, I hope has enlightened folks watching from at home, all of you here who, like myself, didn't have a full appreciation of everything that took place that day and even before. We heard from several witnesses, starting with the family, who gave character evidence. Folks who testified that Hakeem was a good person, that he was a protector, a diligent seeker of knowledge, of Black history. And he was also a fearful Black man in America at the tender age of 20. We heard testimony from activists who were on the ground shortly after Hakeem's life was taken. Testimony that police officers had their hands on their guns, and not just any gun, long guns, automatic and semi-automatic rifles. We heard testimony that an officer placed an activist in a chokehold, said to her in response to her question, "Are you paid enough to commit murder?" "Yes, and you'll be next if you don't shut up." We heard from Black justice warriors, lawyers from the ACLU and the National Conference of Black Lawyers, Brother Mark Fancher, Jeff Edison. Mark spoke about premeditation and deliberation, elements of first-degree murder. He talked about the basic mens rea and actus rea, the mental state, intent, and the actual act that has to occur concurrently in order for a crime to have actually been committed. And I think most insightfully, he spoke of the ease that the criminal justice system gives to police officers when they commit murder and take lives, by saying, no, it was out of fear, it was on impulse, it wasn't premeditated, there was no deliberation. But Mark pushed back, and he gave you food for thought, and he said, no, for 400 years, in connection with the history that Brother Jeff gave, they've been premeditated.
That's right.
They've been deliberating. They were trained to do exactly what they did, not just to Hakeem, but all of our Black brothers and sisters. There's a book of them. There should not be a book of Black lives by state that have been taken from us, from our village, by police officers. We heard from Jeff how police were created to create terror in the Black community. That terror has gone on for hundreds of years, so much so that when you see the lights, when you hear the sirens, something within you seizes up, and then you breathe again once they go by you. That's a terror that Hakeem's family spoke of, that he walked around day in and day out with, in a good neighborhood, not a bad one, not a bombed out neighborhood, a good neighborhood. We heard testimony from journalists, investigative journalist, Diane Bukowski, who spoke about the great lengths that the Detroit Police Department has historically gone to cover up their murderous acts. the lies they tell in court, the slander, and even will go so far as to attempt to criminalize the victim. She shared how it's common practice for even when police officers kill our babies, for them to turn around and say that these babies were throwing up gang signs. These babies were playing with guns, never mind if they're real or not, in an attempt to justify the taking of their lives. We heard from Brother Paul, who wrapped it all up, brought it home for us, who shared with us a different perspective, one that you will never hear from Chief Craig or anyone in the media for that matter. That Hakeem was not a thug, that Hakeem had not committed a murder just days before, that Hakeem in fact was there protecting the life of another black man who had a criminal warrant for a drug crime. Not anything assaultive, violent, worthy of a gang of militarized and armed policemen to approach him, but a drug crime. We also heard testimony from Brother Paul that it can easily be seen, if you're looking for it, the true reason why Hakeem fired his weapon that day at police officers. It wasn't because he didn't value his own life. It wasn't because he thought he was big and bad and could do that and get away with it. He acted out of fear, not for his own life, but for his brother's life. A person who was not even his blood brother. But Hakeem was studied enough to know that I am my brother's keeper. And my brother may not see that officer crouching down in the bush with a weapon pointed at him, but I do. And I, in that moment, in this moment, have to do something. And he did. But that's not the end of it. We saw with our own eyes and we heard with our own ears what happened to Hakeem the moment that he was taken down. The gun was kicked to the side, and we heard 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 shots. Riddled his body. After he no longer posed a threat to anyone. Most painfully, we saw that 10th shot from just a few inches from his head enter his body as he was already down, hands behind his back. The question today is not a simple question of did these officers murder Hakeem? The question is, did they commit first-degree murder with premeditation and deliberation as members of a militarized agency that historically was instituted to terrorize Black lives in response to Black folks saying enough is enough is enough? The answer is what?
Guilty.
Thank you. We're here to answer the question of, did these officers unjustly take Hakeem's life after he was subdued, taken down, gun removed from his reach? And the answer is yes. We're here today to answer the question of whether the head of the Detroit Police Department, the police chief, James Craig, covered up the misconduct of his force, passing it off as oddly transparent, misrepresenting information to the public, thereby giving his officers continued license to kill. And the answer is I wish that we were all sitting in a courtroom in Frank Murphy right now. I wish that instead of the witnesses that took the stand today, we had on trial Chief Craig and the officers that were responsible for taking that beautiful black boy's life. But we don't. And in reality, because of the history that was shared here with you all, because of the elements of first-degree murder, we know not to expect it. But what I offer to you all instead, what I'm taking away today, and what I hope that all of you take away, is that Hakim taught us how to live through his death. Hakim taught us that if we don't stand for something, we will surely fall for anything. Hakim's life should be celebrated. His death is a reminder that we must consistently resist. Resist this narrative that the very people trained to keep us under their foot, to keep us controlled, are certainly not going to ever protect us or serve our interests. I offer to you to live a life that Hakim would be proud of, to continue in that direction of standing up for what's right, being our brothers and sisters' keeper, and to understand our role here in this country as Black folks. And that is to constantly, which we've always done, as Brother Jeff reminded us, constantly fight for the liberation of our Black people. We will lose some more along the way. We will unfortunately have to have more tribunals of this kind because we will lose more along the way. But that is the high price that we pay to keep fighting for what's right. And until we reach that liberation, that's our lot. That is what we will be experiencing. We have to, in some regard, accept that. Because once we accept that that is our fight, we will fully embrace it, and we will fight with all of our might, and fight to the death. Because we know that none of us are free until we are all free. Thank you so much for coming out today.